Last year we talked about the positive emotional attractor and the negative attractor, and how has that work been evolving over the intervening year?
Well, the work on looking at how the positive and negative emotional attractor affect everything from treatment adherence to people's excitement about their work, to engagement in organizations, even to how they feel about their families, continues to evolve. I mean, we're getting, every 6 to 8 months there's another dissertation done or another study that's going on. Right now, one of the things we're looking at is it looks like the positive emotional attractor and the negative both get very much engaged and reinforced each, depending upon a person's relationships. So one of the things we're doing more of now is looking at how these two, not quite in opposition, but almost in opposition states get aroused or set off or activated, if you will, in their interactions with other people. The idea being quite simple: if we can help people understand it, then whether you're trying to manage someone or you're trying to coach them or you're trying to help them in some other way as a doctor, nurse, professor, teacher, the idea is how to help somebody move back and forth between these two states, because we need both. Without the negative emotional attractor, we won't survive. It is our body's a way of activating and dealing with anything that's threatening in the environment, but also adapting. The positive emotional attractor is what opens us up. That allows us to consider possibilities and to go in new and different directions. Well, we can't spend all of our time in one or the other, so what we're now spending a lot of our research is looking at is what kinds of interactions, what kinds of relationships, what things can you say or do with another person in a relationship that helps move you back and forth in a more effective way.
So if I'm understanding correctly, we're all going in the direction of continuing to build capacity in people, and that is in a broader range of settings now? I
would say that may be the intent, that people may want to build more capacity in other people, but very often they do it in a way which does the exact opposite, which diminishes the other person. So that when somebody wants you to act a certain way, it's what we call managing or coaching for compliance. I'm trying to get you to be the person I want you to be. And what that does is inevitably sets off some defensiveness on your part. You say, wait a minute, your body goes into protecting itself, and you go into what I call the negative emotional attractor, which, because of the physiological aspects of it and the neurological, leads a person to start to defend themselves. So they close down cognitively and emotionally and perceptually. So if you're trying to encourage somebody or motivate them in some way to change, when you typically approach it by saying, I know what you should do here, this is what you should do, it does the opposite. They, in fact, go into a preservation containment mode, and they literally stop listening. So what we've been exploring for the past 2 or 3 years now is how doing things that might seem counterintuitive at first actually get to that result, which is to talk to a person about their dreams, to talk about their sense of purpose in life or their calling or legacy, to talk about core values. That what happens is when a person gets involved in that in a conversation, they literally go into a set of neural substrates and endocrine or hormonal processes that open them up to new possibilities. So that is the point at which a person might consider why they might look at change in some way. But it also is really focused on them, not on your image of what they should be. So that becomes a different motivating force.
And if I remember correctly, that's what you would label, rather than coaching for compliance, you call that coaching for or with compassion?
Coaching with compassion, that's right. And the idea is simple, is that if we look at compassion not for feeling for someone in pain, but as something bigger than that, opening yourself up to others, that then the most generous act we can do and the most motivating with someone would be to help them realize that in my interaction with you, I'm really focused on what you want, out of life? Where are your dreams? What are your key values? What are the virtues you aspire to? And then if I can help you make a connection between that and these other ways you might look at life or act or feel about things, then you have a context, a rationale, and a reason for doing them. But without that, it's just somebody else telling you who you should be.
And the research, if I'm understanding, is saying that when someone is telling whoever you are what to do, that's going to engage all of the resistance patterns and on all levels.
Even if you know the person, excuse me, even if you know the person loves you and cares about you, even if the person does it with all good meaning and good intent, it still feels to some extent like an imposition, either because you think the person is kind of pushing on you, or because you feel if you love or honor the person, you want to be good and respond to their wishes for you, so you feel guilty. So this notion of guilt, of obligation, I mean, it's a part of life, but it also, when dosed too much, which happens very quickly, puts a person into a defensive mode. And all we're saying is that when sustained change happens in people's behavior, in their dreams, in their values, in their perspectives, in their attitudes, in their ways of looking at the world, it almost always evolves from an early experience in the positive emotional attractor where you're considering a new way to be or act. And then you move into the negative to get some of the work done. Then you move back to the positive emotional attractor to allow your body to rejuvenate itself and get more energy, and again, recheck with openness, is this what I really want? And then you go back. So it is this back and forth swing. But because in some longer term ecological sense, our bodies are designed to help us defend ourselves against the ultimate threat of death, that one of the things that happens is, as various researchers have shown, that bad emotions are stronger than good. So we will respond to those very quickly. As a result, to have this process of back and forth between what I and my colleagues are calling the positive and negative emotional attractor, to have a balance there means you have to overweight the positive. Because the negative, when it hits, is going to hit with more viciousness or more vigor or more intensity.
And it sounds as if the overweighting of the positive is, in some ways, as you said, counterintuitive.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the example I use is that if you have a teenager who brings the car home and next morning you notice that there's a dent that wasn't there when the car left, is your first thought when you confront the teenager, tell me about your dreams about driving? No. I mean, your first thing is you start to vomit on them and start to punish them. And what you're doing is either venting your fear as a parent that they might have been hurt, an ultimate fear, but you also may be trying to exact some punishment or revenge. But in none of those scenarios is the major thing on your mind, how do I help them change their behavior? Because if it was, you wouldn't do that.
Right. But we don't think of it that way.
Not at those moments, no.
How do you see these theories and this work beginning to spread into the field of coaching or in specific areas, if you do?
Well, I remember at some point last winter or spring, I was approached by somebody who has an internet-based network of coaches throughout continental Europe. And they asked if they'd read some of my articles, they'd heard me at some conference, and they asked if they could post one of my key articles, which I did, one of the latest ones on the fMRI study, and would I be willing to at least hear the reactions of their members? Well, their members were mostly offended because at an early statement in the paper, I said most people who engage in coaching don't think about the positive, don't think about the possibility, don't coach people to vision. Well, they took exception to that, and they thought that was ridiculous, that in the methods they use, each and every one of them, in the methods they've been trained in, they all use that stuff. So in the process of reacting to some of these comments through these various blogs and discussion groups, I posed the question, I wasn't talking about your group of sophisticated coaches. I was talking about any parent, any manager, anybody who tries to coach or influence somebody else. And then they come backed off a little bit. But I would say today, most people who are professional coaches know that they would rather pull to the positive than push on the negative. Now, the problem is that when they're in consulting companies and they're trying to sell contracts to certain purchases of those services, they want the change results quickly. And in the quickness starts to get this distortion of efficacy. So they start to say, well, let's push people early on towards overcoming some of the weaknesses, because that will be a more efficient way to get change. When in fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. If we let it take some time, we started with the vision, you might actually get enduring or sustained change. So I think that this idea of pulling to the positive, the importance of vision. I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was at conferences and talking about coaching or helping relationships, very seldom did somebody talk about that. Today, I would say, even this morning, of the first 8 people that have spoken, 7 of them mentioned vision, mission, purpose as a key pull in the change process.
What I'm hearing in this, I think, and it's also my experience in my own coaching, is that we're moving further and further away from the coach as the solution finder. Towards the other direction, the coach as the facilitator of the person in finding their own, something like that?
Well, I think that's very accurate, is that it was too easy for us in the past to look at the coach as the savior. And even in the concept that we were talking about this morning in the session of the coach as a change agent, yes, that's true, but the question is, whose agenda is the coach pursuing? And that's where I think if the coach feels that he or she is the person responsible for the change in how you're living or how you're working, they're going to push. And what's going to happen is your natural reaction is going to be at first to say, well, I should do this. And then, 3 or 4 days later, when things get tough at work or something bad happens at home, you're going to say, oh, the hell with it. When you reach for your chunky monkey ice cream or your second glass of wine or whatever it is that makes you feel a little better. And in the process, kind of undoing the change effort. So I think that although the coach does have a tremendous potential, right now I'm very aware of the fact that I see no data to suggest that the percentage of people who are professionally coaching are any more efficacious than the percentage of managers, which in my data suggests that 70 to 80% aren't adding value now, of managers. Now in coaches, I don't see any data about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. And it doesn't mean that the people weren't effective before, but I think coaches, like anybody, can suffer from the effects of chronic stress and burnout. I also think that until individuals and organizations come to coaching with a more open, multi-level approach where they're inviting you to work with them and actually literally their families and their work teams and others, we're going to have this constraint in the relationship as imposed by whoever's paying for the service. So one of the things I know in our advanced coaching courses at Case Western Reserve University, a lot of times people will ask us as they're getting new into coaching or they've just started a coaching practice and they're starting to build up more clients. How do I handle the issue that the person's dreams are going in this direction, but the company's paying me and they want the person to go in this direction? And I think that's a very common dilemma. And unfortunately, if the consultant takes the what they might think is the most prudent way out, which is to go with who's paying for the service, then what will happen is either the person's not going to really pay attention anyway to the coaching, or they'll end up deciding that they have to leave. When in fact, my experience with higher level managers and executives in coaching over the past 20, 30, 40 years almost, is that very often if they have a lot of years invested in an organization and they start to discover a dream of theirs that is different than what they're currently doing, they've got the ability to change the structure of their work in their organization a lot easier than to change organizations. So I find that if you encourage people to articulate or reaffirm their personal vision, even though it might be different than what they're currently doing, it doesn't mean they'll automatically leave the organization. So then the question is the consultant or the coach sophisticated enough or experienced enough to be able to explain that to the purchaser of the services? And that's, and I don't mean to overstate that issue of the transaction versus the potential transformation, but I think that's one of those things that seduces people into sometimes making the wrong decisions.
And I think it's very, very true, and the tension of that. Right. But I also agree with you that if the coach is sophisticated enough and has a broad enough base of experience and quite frankly has done their own work on themselves, which would be my languaging, then maybe they can help the person recontext that this doesn't necessarily mean a change of situation, but they bring their own creativity and their own vision into the situation.
But the saddest thing, I should say, is when people, after a while of being in the coaching field or being a consultant or trainer or doctor, nurse, professor, teacher, any of the helping professions, one of the things that happens is if you start to experience the fatigue that inevitably comes from all of the responsibility and the demands of the work, that if you can't kind of reframe, reorient, revitalize yourself, you're a diminishing source of energy. Absolutely. And that's the point that I think you were just making, that it is that issue of confronting your own dream. Am I enjoying myself? Is this fun? And if it's fun when you're coaching 4 or 5 people a day, but it's really fatiguing if you're coaching 8, then it says you shouldn't coach more than 4 or 5 people in the day. And you have to find some way to make that model work, rather than go the other way and to say, well, I'll just push myself.
Yeah, which is natural to most of us to think, okay, well, I'll just do more and harder, but diminishing returns, as you said. What do you think that the frontiers of your work are? What's the next stages, next steps?
There are a number of different aspects of it. One of them is the continuing of the neuroscience work, because we're zeroing in. We've got another study now, the follow-up to the fMRI study on the coaching, in which we showed the impact of 30 minutes of coaching to the positive emotional attractive versus the negative, and how one opened people up neurologically 5 days later and the other closed them down. We now have, in this next study, are going to have people write a vision versus talk to someone in a coaching conversation about it, as a way to see, is it the creation of the vision that's the potent activator of this more positive neural substrates, or is it the talking about someone? We suspect that it's the talking to someone about it that's the more potent act neurologically. Because the parts of the brain that get activated, like the posterior cingulate cortex, when you consider new possibilities, are the parts of the brain that get activated when you are interacting with other people that you care about or you feel care about you. So we suspect that when you're into the task mode, which very often happens in the executive function of the brain, you may in fact be focusing, which gets you a lot done in a narrow way, but you're not open to possibilities. So when you're trying to vision, when you're trying to consider alternate futures, you want to be in the other realm, which we suspect is more social. So that's part of why we want to test this out. We're also trying to begin a set of experiments with, in our case, middle-aged and younger graduate students, then eventually, in maybe 2 or 3 years with undergraduates, where we try to help them understand how their brains are operating through looking at scans of themselves and see if we can help them create activities early on in their programs that not only inoculate them against stress to some extent, but give them some of the relationships that can help them go through in a more meaningful way their developmental experience. Because we think our hypothesis is that we could help people have a much higher retention of what they're learning. Because right now it's abysmal as to how little people remember. Half-life of knowledge from a graduate required course, I think, has been shown to be 6.5 weeks. And so one of the things we're after is what helps retention. Well, we're also after this dilemma of, the study that came out last February that out of the UCLA Center showing that freshmen in North America right now are more depressed, under more emotional distress than they have been since the 60s. And several of us, not just at Case Western Reserve University, but a number of universities that have talked about this, suspect that one of the issues is that people feel alone. And they may have friends, but they aren't in relationships where they can talk about the wide range of things. And if you're in a relationship, but you have to keep worrying about your image, it doesn't work that way. So one of the things we're thinking about is how do you increase the kind of peer relationships and the quality of them with a small group. Any of us have gone through doctoral programs or long graduate programs like a 3-year law degree, know that you don't get through it without forming study groups. And even though you might be in different specialties, you stay with the same study group. Well, we're beginning to suspect that we should structurally introduce people to that in their first few weeks in a graduate program or an undergraduate program.
To build a support structure right from the beginning.
That's right. And one word that I'm using for it is it's peer coaching. It's not just people that you can vent with, it's also people who will help you with your various coursework as well as making decisions about should I join this team or go to that activity and things like that. But the world in our electronic connectedness has emphasized what Granovetter calls weak ties, I think. So we have a lot of Facebook friends and we have a lot of LinkedIn people and we Twitter to the world at large. But the question is, within that, are there people that we touch base with on a regular basis about a wide range of issues? And
that's where my mind just went. My mind went to what you said about the difference in writing down a vision and in stating it out and thinking of the interaction in a study group in person or on the phone or whatever, and the difference between that and Facebook, for example. So there's a huge piece. Yeah,
so that's one direction, is the insight from the neuroscience research. Another direction is this issue of the what I call peer coaching. How do you help not just have a coach relationship, but how do you help people build what Kathy Cramp calls their developmental network? Or sometimes I'll have people frame it as who's their personal board of directors. But the idea is, who are the cluster of people that you'll chat with on a regular basis? And now once you have that cluster, I think you don't have to have all of it be face-to-face. Some of it could be on Facebook, and some of it can be on the telephone, and some of it can be text messaging. But you still need periodic face-to-face to be able to have the degree of emotional contagion that you need for both the task activity and the social. So this isn't just to help the social. This is also to help, are you learning your algebra and your calculus? Are you learning your physics the way you need to?
Well, and it also suggests in terms of coaching the need for that in-person or in some way in-person connect, even if it's episodic, with phone calls in between. And I know, again, in my own practice, that it's crucial that you can't just go on.
Can't just be by telephone all the time. So right now, I know in the Financial Times, I think it was about 2 years ago, they had this review that showed there were 87,000 people enrolled in fully online MBA programs around the world. Now, when I was on the board of GMAC in the 90s, early and mid-90s, we were graduating 94 to 96,000 MBAs a year. And that means that almost the entire whole market 15 years ago is now in fully online, not hybrid, but fully online programs. That raises a very interesting dilemma. I mean, even if you think that the MBA might be an efficacious degree, which I'm not sure it is in many cases, given the experience that people have, now we're going to make it online because it's convenient, which is important. It's often less expensive. And it's more experimental. And in that sense, it may be more around today's media rather than yesterday's. But in the process, if we don't have the hybrid experiences where periodically you get together and work with each other, I'm not sure the wholeness of the experience is going to be there. But I think we have to experiment to see.
It's absolutely fascinating. Let me just check and see.
The other theme that some of the research is going in, while a lot of what I've been doing is focusing on coaching relationships in organizations or, teacher-student relationships at the university level, a number of my colleagues and I are beginning to look at the doctor-patient, nurse-patient relationship.
That was going to be my next question, is
Right.
where are you seeing the differences in how coaching has impact in a business setting or a university setting or medical setting?
The differences between the helping relationships that happens between a doctor and a patient, nurse-patient, teacher-student, and a manager-subordinate, or a trainer-subordinate, or a coach, a person coaching in an organization, are negligible, in my view, because in each case there's a power relationship. There is a theoretical, if not real, difference in expertise. And very often the person in the more powerful position could easily impose on the other person what they think they should be doing. So I think we are discovering now, with a number of these dissertations going on, that, and there are two that are just finishing their data analysis right now that I'm working with, one with IT professionals and one with physicians who are organizational leaders versus physicians who are clinical leaders versus non-leaders. That in both sets, the power of shared vision and the power of shared compassion in their relationships with each other has an amazing predictive effect on engagement, on energy, on how committed they feel in what they're doing, and ultimately, I would guess, in their effectiveness.
And none of those are things that you can impose.
That's right. And a lot of it is, this goes back to when I was in graduate school in the late 60s and early 70s. In psychology, people were talking about approach versus avoidance. And in one of our fMRI studies on resonant versus dissonant leaders that's being published in Leadership Quarterly, one of the things we showed was that when we had 49-year-old subjects, males and females, who remembered key moments with resonant leaders and key moments with dissonant leaders in their lives, a number of weeks later, we put them through a scanner and we're getting them to recall those specific moments, because we take pieces out of the interviews and say it back to them, that the consistent networks, neural networks aroused in recalling high emotional experiences with resonant leaders were ones in which people come together, are more approach, are more engaged in a positive emotional contagion, are more social. The ones with the dissonant leaders activated some of those, but the majority of them were the opposite, were not only avoidance, but were deactivation, which is a form of suppression of these more positive things. So, and this is dealing with recollections of key moments. So my guess is that this whole difference between pulling people versus pushing people is one of those underlying truisms of life that we keep reinventing, but still holds a lot of promise, because our socialization and our training, whether as doctors or nurses or managers, we keep thinking that because we are socialized and know more, we should be telling people what they should be doing.
Kind of looks like the opposite is true. Huh?
That's right.
And in pretty much any setting you can think of, if I'm hearing you right.
That's right. We suspect that. Now, I'm not saying, and it's not like you only be positive. Let me go back to the earlier statement, because it really requires a movement between the positive and negative emotional attractor. So just like with teenagers, if you don't create some structure, they're going to be teens gone wild kind of thing and run amok. On the other hand, if too much of the structure is there, then the teen either goes underground or represses it, and then you're into 2 decades of psychotherapy later.
And what my mother did to me kind of stuff. Yeah, so again,
Right.
we're talking about balancing, and we're talking about balancing in a different way than perhaps we have.
That's right, balance, but we have to overemphasize the positive because the negative is so potent.
Thank you very much. I really
You're welcome.
appreciate it.